I want to take this section out of the IPG, and this one. Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this month is how I would fix Magic's rules and policy. You know, it seems like every time I make a video on certain topics, I get a bunch of comments saying that we should change the rules or the policy because the current system doesn't handle that specific situation very well. This episode won't be about cases that are complicated by necessity. Having a system need to handle tens of thousands of cases spanning decades is already a big ask after all, and that's before you add in the other requirements like needing to make sense. Sometimes a system handles certain cases poorly, but because of the interconnected nature of Magic, this is the cost to be paid for handling most other cases well, and any change is likely to have unintended effects elsewhere that make it a net negative. This episode won't be about those either. There's also some times where the rules around a specific topic are pretty generally agreed to be screwed up, but I don't have a great idea for what would make it better. This is the case for Enter the Battlefield replacement effects, for example. The system we have now is a patchwork of ad hoc fixes and kludges to address specific rulings, such that if we wanted to make that make sense, I think the best course of action would be to scrap it all and start fresh. There are, however, a few specific areas of Magic's rule and policy that I think could benefit from a change. These areas have the potential for a simpler or more natural answer without breaking or changing too much else. And the first one that I'll be talking about shouldn't be a surprise for anyone who's followed this channel for a while. That's right, I'm going right after one of my biggest clients right away, the Blood Moon rule. This is the rule that says, for some reason, becoming a mountain gets rid of any abilities the land has, but becoming a mountain in addition to your other types does not. This is the rule that makes it so that Blood Moon is able to take away abilities from lands in Layer 4, which is before Layer 6 when ability removing usually happens. This is the rule that if I were ever to gain access to the source CR file on Wizard servers, my first action would be to highlight it and delete it with my middle finger. I'll let you all keep the rule that says planes inherently have the ability to tap for white, even though that one's also on thin ice with me as well. But sure, being able to tap for the appropriate color of mana is something that's inherently tied to the identity of having a basic land type, and I at least understand that. But there are lots of mountains that have abilities completely unrelated to tapping for mana, so why would becoming a mountain take those abilities away? As far as I can tell, the only reason is because Blood Moon predates all those other cards, and the rules team opted to change the rules rather than change that card's oracle text every time. And in case you're wondering why Wizards hasn't already done this, I've got a pretty good idea. In order to keep the same functionality for Blood Moon and all the other similar cards that take advantage of this rule, they would need to errata all of them, such that it said on the card that it removed all the abilities from the land. And this is what they already have to do for cards like Witness Protection and Sugarcoat, so it's really a toss-up between what's more confusing, having cards that change a land's type not work the same way, or having a bunch of cards which are the old physical printings of these cards not match what the card actually does. In my book, that's already the situation currently, so issuing a ton of errata is the only real hurdle to overcome. Let's rip off the Band-Aid already, Wizards. Following along the same vein, let's say that you used an Oko +1 against a Dryad Arbor. What would its type line look like? Well, that's right, it's a creature-elf. Pretty straightforward. Well, here's another one. Let's say we play another Dryad Arbor and we cast a Suit Up on it. What are that Dryad Arbor's card types? And yep, it's an artifact creature land -forest Dryad. Wait, what? Go ahead, try and come up with a reason why that one gets to stay being a land and the other one doesn't. And no, the answer has nothing to do with the fact that Oko makes Dryad Arbor lose all its abilities. The actual answer is that Suit Up says Dryad Arbor is an artifact creature, whereas Oko just makes it a creature. Usually effects that set a card's type overwrite everything unless that card specifically says that it gets to retain a previous type. But for some reason, effects making something into a artifact creature inherently have special handling built in. I talked about this a lot more in my video on Dryad Arbor plus Relics Roar, so you can check that out if you'd like a more detailed overview. If it were up to me, I would cancel the artifact creature exception, and I probably wouldn't have to issue any errata at all because this one doesn't really come up very often outside of contrived rules questions. Next up is one that sounds simple, but in practice there are a lot of complications that make this one a lot more difficult than most people expect. What does once per turn mean? Now, to see why this is not as simple as it sounds, let's take a look at this example. Amy's Dermotaxi has exiled Homicide Investigator and become a copy of it. Some creature dies, so Amy investigates. Then Amy uses Dermotaxi's ability to make it into a copy of Homicide Investigator again. Now, if another creature dies, will she get to investigate again? Well, how about if Dermataxi has exiled a Dionys Elvis Archdruid? And there is not an obvious way that such abilities interact with effects that have you gain or lose abilities, specifically by themselves or by having the permanent become a copy of something. I talked about this in my episode on Nadu plus Dress Down, and to this day there's no mention of this topic anywhere in the comprehensive rules. The only source we have to answer these sort of questions is to rule by analogy from one of the rulings that have been delivered by Wizards of the Coast on a similar topic through their official channels, those being the personal Twitter or now Blue Sky accounts of the rules postkin. In my video on the topic, I mentioned that we probably are a ways away from a solution here, since there are a lot of non-obvious corner cases that would need to be navigated. So I am at least hopeful that something is coming, more so than I am for some of these other ones. I had hoped the exhaust mechanic from Ether Drift would be what catapulted this issue to the forefront enough to get a proper rule added, but I suppose I need to be patient for a bit longer. Next up is a quick hit that I've covered before, but what would happen if you controlled a Season of the Witch and a Silent Arbiter? Would Season of the Witch destroy all of your creatures except the one that actually attacked? Or would Silent Arbiter's ability mean that those creatures couldn't attack and thus are safe from Season of the Witch? This too is not discussed anywhere in the CR, and I find it particularly annoying that the rules team saw fit to define what it meant to have to attack when Furkrog was printed, but they couldn't be bothered to rigorously define what it means to be able to attack at the same time. And now another quick hit, one that also particularly annoys me. Let's say that you play a Mindslaver and use it against your opponent, and you have them cast a Burning Wish. Any logical person would think that you would then get to look at their sideboard, pick a sorcery card, and put it into their hand, right? Wrong. Because of this line from the MTR, which says that you cannot access a player's sideboard while you're controlling them. Why is that? Well, the official explanation from when they changed it has been taken down, but if you check the Internet Archive link in my description, you can see that Wizards said looking at another player's sideboard wastes a lot of time and adds a lot of note-taking. But I'm calling BS on that explanation because anyone who's actually played these effects knows that your opponent would almost always concede immediately after you ask to look at their sideboard. So really, the old rule generally saved time. Besides, no one's complaining about how long it takes to resolve a Thoughtseize, and that takes a comparable amount of time to note down what's in their hand, since people's sideboards generally contain mostly 2, 3, or 4 ofs. So you aren't normally going to have to write down more than 5 or 6 discrete card names anyway. So, if I'm not buying the official explanation, what do I think brought on this change? Well, the update article that I linked states that Wizards R&D specifically requested this change, which is in itself unusual, since normally changes to Magic's policy documents are driven by the judges who are in charge of maintaining them. Why would Wizards want this specific change, and why at this time specifically? In my opinion, the reason that they made this change is because Emrakul the Promised End was about to be in Standard, and the functionality to look at your opponent's sideboard was not in Magic's online client. So rather than properly implement it, they just changed the rules so they wouldn't have to. I've linked a couple of other threads from Reddit that can give some additional background on this change if you'd like to dig a little bit deeper into this theory. Now, I don't mind that Wizards changed the rules on a fringe scenario that's only coming up in a handful of events. I don't even mind that they did it because their arena dev team was either too lazy or too incompetent to implement the correct functionality on their own. The part that really annoys me is that they tried to gaslight everybody into thinking that the reasoning for that change was something else. And remember, the topic today is things that I would change that would make some aspect of rules or policy make more sense without breaking or changing anything else too much. And I definitely say that this one qualifies. So if you'll notice, that last change was a change for Magic's policy documents rather than the rules. And I actually have one more policy change that I'd like to see through. And I saved the best for last because I imagine this one is going to be a pretty spicy take. I want to take this section out of the IPG. And this one. Okay, now that I've got your attention, does that mean Judge Dave wants bribery and match fixing to be legal? Of course not. But I think the discussion is a little bit more nuanced than a lot of judges seem to think. Back in the day when the concept of a Magic tournament was still in its infancy, it was figured out pretty quickly that this sort of stuff should definitely be against the rules because certain jurisdictions have laws that are very strict, and tournament organizers did not want to have to talk to that kind of judge. So when the official Magic policy documents were written, the language around these topics was pretty zero tolerance, the logic being that if the wrong person got even a hint of the idea that Magic equals gambling, everyone could be going to jail. now that we've got that historical background in place, I want you to imagine something. You just sat down at your LGS for a round of F&M, and your opponent pulled out a cigarette and lit it. What do you think would happen to that player? Or maybe your opponent spells strongly of a certain type of plant. Or your opponent has a firearm clearly visible on their belt. None of these things are explicitly prohibited by any of Magic's policy documents, and while I'm sure you could make a case that such behaviors might be disruptive to the tournament or affect the comfort level of the participants, the fact is that none of the behaviors that I just mentioned is universally considered unacceptable. And in fact, there are stores where each of those is probably happening every week without anybody giving it a second thought. Now that being said, if you are at a serious tournament, like a Grand Prix, the equivalent of those today, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to continue playing because major tournament organizers and the venues that major tournaments are held in tend to have their own policies against that stuff. In fact, I've been judging large-scale events for over a decade, and I can only think of one problem that's ever resulted from any of them, which is ironically far fewer than the dozens of times I've seen people run afoul of the policies on bribery, wagering, and improperly determining a winner. So if local laws and venue and tournament policies are enough to keep those other behaviors in check, I think it's at least worth having the conversation about whether it makes sense to let them do the heavy lifting on enforcement for bribery, wagering, and improperly determining the winner too. What's the upside? Tournament officials can tailor their policies to what makes sense for their events. If a store wants to run a pack per win F&M and two players have gone to time and want to roll a die to see who gets the pack, they can just let that happen. If a group of friends wants to make an agreement where whichever of them places highest at the RC has to buy dinner that night, they can do it. I had an episode a few months ago talking about prize splits after a high-profile and controversial disqualification related to that issue. While that DQ was correct per policy, an organizer who is running a Glengarry-Glen Ross event where first prize is a $50,000 1 out of 4 exclusive promo and second prize is a box of some standard set, they might appreciate a little bit of extra flexibility to do something special in recognition of the unique circumstances. If Wizards was to remove these lines from policy and give control of those decisions to the tournament organizer, well, they would probably have to include something in the rules for sanctioning RCQs and similar events to keep people from organizing the results among themselves. But then again, Flesh and Blood literally lets players buy and sell their equivalent of Pro Tour invites, and I haven't heard of anything bad happening to them, so maybe not. And that's all I have for you today. What did you think of my proposed changes? Is there anything you wish that I would have covered? Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling, and until then, I hope you have a great day.